Screams tore through the night as Beyoncé stepped onto the red carpet. But a single voice, shrill, venomous, and dripping with spite, slashed through the adoration like a blade, silencing the crowd with its audacity. Beyoncé, you thief. Sasha's melody was hers, and you stole it, you fraud. The air thickened with shock, a suffocating weight pressing down as every head swiveled. As darting between the man in the ragged denim jacket, his phone thrust out like a loaded gun, and the woman who'd ruled music for decades, now rooted to the spot. Her body trembling with a rage so palpable it seemed to ripple the fabric of her gold gown. Flashbulbs popped furiously, casting jagged shadows across her face, and the crowd's cheers dissolved into a stunned, electric hush, their collective gaze pinning her like a specimen under glass. She turned slowly, deliberately, her breath catching in sharp, uneven gasps, and when she spoke, her voice was a live wire, sparking with fury and hurt. You think you can scream that at me? You think you've got any right to rip me apart in front of the world? The words flew out, raw and unpolished, each syllable laced with an emotion so fierce it stunned the onlookers into silence, their phones raised high, capturing every second of the unraveling. His smirk widened, a cruel twist of his lips that fed off her reaction, and he leaned into the chaos he'd ignited, his voice taunting and loud. Oh, look at Queen Bee, all shook up. What's next, huh? Gonna cry? Gonna call your lawyers? The crowd recoiled, a ripple of gasps and winces washing through them. But Beyoncé didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the carpet like gunshots, her eyes locked on his, burning with a fire that felt ancient, unquenchable. You don't know what I've carried, what I've fought through. You don't know a damn thing about me, she shot back, her tone dropping to a dangerous, velvet-edged growl that sent a shiver racing through the air. The accusation wasn't new. She'd heard the whispers before, claims of borrowed beats, recycled riffs. But this was different. This was personal, flung at her on a night meant to honor her mentorship, her lifeline to artists like Sasha, whose name he dared to drag into his venom. Her chest tightened, a storm of humiliation and defiance churning inside her, and her hands balled into fists, nails biting into her palms as she fought to hold herself together under the weight of his words and the world's greedy stare. Around her, the red carpet sprawled like a glittering war zone, reporters frozen mid-question, fans clutching their signs with trembling hands, security poised at the edges, their eyes darting between her and the man. But she waved them off with a sharp flick of her wrist, her focus unwavering. The man laughed, a harsh, grating bark that scraped against the night, and he tilted his head, his voice slick with mockery. Go on, then prove it. Tell us how you're so innocent, how you're still the queen. The crowd shifted, some shrinking back, others leaning in, their murmurs swelling into a low roar, shock, excitement, disbelief all tangled together as they watched her teeter on the edge of something explosive. I don't owe you proof, she snarled, her voice trembling now, not with fear but with a fury that felt like it could crack the earth beneath her feet. I bled for this, for every note, every kid I've pulled up behind me, and you stand there, spitting lies like they're candy? Her words hung there, heavy and jagged, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The cameras zooming in on the sweat glistening on her brow, the tight line of her jaw, the way her eyes shimmered with something too raw to name. The man didn't back down. He stepped closer, his phone shaking slightly in his grip, his defiance a mirror to hers as he sneered, Yeah, keep talking, babe. Maybe if you yell loud enough, we'll all forget what you did. The crowd gasped again, louder this time, a wave of tension crashing over them, and Beyoncé's breath hitched, her composure fraying at the edges as memories flooded in. Nights spent perfecting tracks, mornings mentoring kids like Sasha. Years of scrutiny she'd borne with a smile. You want to talk about forgetting? She fired back, her voice rising, sharp and unyielding. How about you forget whatever sad little life made you think this was your moment? The words landed like a slap, and the crowd erupted, some cheering, some shouting, a chaotic symphony of reactions as the air crackled with the heat of their clash. Security moved in now, their hands hovering near the man. But Beyoncé held up a palm, stopping them cold, her gaze never leaving his face, her heart pounding so loud she could feel it in her throat. The cameras caught it all, the tremble in her lips, the fire in her eyes, the way she stood there, a titan on the brink, and the onlookers knew they were seeing something real, something that could shatter her myth or forge it anew. Right there under the merciless glare of the lights. Her mind raced, a torrent of emotions clawing at her, anger at his gall, pain at the betrayal of being misunderstood, pride in the empire she'd built brick by brick. She'd faced worse, death threats, lawsuits, betrayals, but this felt sharper, more intimate, a wound ripped open in front of millions. I don't break for people like you, she said, her voice steadying now, each word deliberate, cutting deeper than his taunts ever could. You're nothing, just noise in a crowd that's louder than you'll ever be. The man faltered, just for a second, his smirk flickering, and the crowd felt it too, the shift, the power swinging back to her, though the tension still hung thick, a storm waiting to break. Reporters scribbled furiously, fans whispered to each other, their faces alight with awe and unease, and Beyoncé stood there, chest heaving, knowing she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, her humanity laid bare for the world to judge. The night stretched on, the red carpet a stage for a drama no one had scripted, and as the cameras rolled, everyone waited, breathless, for what came next. The crowd's murmurs swelled into a chaotic hum as Beyoncé stood there, her eyes locked on the man who dared to unravel her in front of the world, his phone still pointed at her like a challenge he refused to drop. His smirk lingered, but it was fraying now, a thin veneer stretched tight over something unsteady, and she saw it, the flicker of doubt in his gaze, the way his fingers twitched around the device as her words sank in. She took another step forward, her heels striking the carpet with a sound that echoed in the tense silence, and the air between them crackled with an energy that felt alive, unpredictable, ready to ignite. You think this is a game? She asked, her voice low and steady, each word carved out with a precision that made the onlookers lean closer, their breaths held tight. You think you can just yell nonsense and walk away like it doesn't mean anything? The man shifted his weight, his bravado slipping as he opened his mouth to retort, but she didn't give him the chance. She pressed on, her tone sharpening as she continued. I've spent my life building something real, lifting people up. And you're out here trying to tear it down with nothing but your own bitterness to back it up. Her words landed hard, and the crowd reacted. Some gasped, others nodded, a few even clapped, their reactions splintering the atmosphere into jagged pieces. He recovered quickly, his jaw tightening as he shoved his phone closer, his voice rising to match hers, shrill and defiant. Real? You call stealing real? Sasha's out there struggling while you're up here in your fancy dress, taking what's hers. The accusation stung, a fresh wound ripped open, and Beyoncé's hands trembled at her sides, not from fear but from the effort it took to hold herself together when every fiber of her wanted to scream. She could feel the eyes of the crowd boring into her, the reporters scribbling, the fans whispering, all of them waiting for her to crack. But she wouldn't, not yet. Instead, she tilted her head, studying him like he was a puzzle she could solve, and then she laughed, a short, sharp sound that caught everyone off guard, slicing through the tension like a sudden gust of wind. Struggling, she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. You don't even know her, do you? You don't know what I've done for her, what I've done for so many. The man blinked, thrown by the shift, and the crowd murmured louder, sensing something brewing beneath her words, something they couldn't yet grasp. Before he could respond, a woman's voice cut in from the edge of the ropes, high-pitched, trembling, but firm. Leave her alone. She's given more than you'll ever understand. It was a fan, a young woman with braided hair and a handmade sign that read, Bay Forever. Her face flushed with indignation as she pushed against the barrier, her eyes blazing. The man whipped around, his phone swinging toward her, and he snapped, Stay out of it, princess. This ain't your fight. But the interruption threw him off balance, and Beyoncé seized the moment, her voice rising now, carrying over the chaos. No, let her talk. Let's all talk, since you think you've got the floor. The crowd erupted, shouts of support, a few jeers, a tangle of voices clashing as the scene spiraled into something wilder, messier. Security moved closer, their hands hovering near their earpieces, but Beyoncé waved them back again, her focus splitting between the man and the fan, her mind racing as she tried to navigate the storm she'd been dragged into. The man turned back to her, his face reddening, his composure cracking as he shouted, You don't get to play the hero here. I've seen the truth, Sasha's broke, and you're raking it in. His words were sloppy now, desperation creeping in, and Beyoncé's eyes narrowed, her patience thinning as she stepped even closer, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his chest heaved with every ragged breath. Broke? She said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to strain to hear her. You've got no idea what you're talking about. I paid for Sasha's studio time, her tour, her rent when she couldn't make it. You're yelling about something you didn't even bother to check. The revelation hung there, a quiet bomb detonating in the space between them, and the crowd fell silent for a heartbeat, processing her words before the whispers started again, louder, faster, a wave of confusion and surprise rolling through them. The man's mouth opened, then closed, his phone dipping slightly as he scrambled for a response, but she didn't wait. She pressed on, her voice steady, but laced with something raw, something wounded. You want to judge me? Fine. But at least know what you're judging. The fan with the sign shouted again, emboldened now, her voice shaking with emotion. She's telling the truth. Sasha's my cousin. She talks about Bay all the time, how she saved her. The man spun toward her, his face twisting with frustration, and he barked, "Shut up. You don't know nothing." But the crowd was shifting now, their allegiance wavering, their murmurs turning into questions. Could it be true? Had Beyoncé really done that? The man's eyes darted around, sensing the tide turning, and he doubled down, his voice cracking as he yelled at Beyoncé, "You're lying. You're just covering your tracks." She didn't flinch. She stood taller, her gaze piercing through him as she said, "I don't need to lie. I've got receipts, and I've got people who know the real story." "What VE you got? A phone and a loud mouth?" The crowd buzzed, some laughing, others cheering, and the man's bravado crumbled further, his hands shaking as he clutched his device like a lifeline, his plan unraveling under the weight of her calm, unrelenting truth. The air grew heavier, the tension coiling tighter as onlookers began to argue among themselves, some defending her, others doubting, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus that threatened to drown out everything else. Beyoncé's chest rose and fell quickly, her emotions swirling, anger at the accusation, pride in her work, exhaustion from having to prove herself yet again. She glanced at the fan, then back at the man, and for a moment, her eyes softened, a flicker of something human breaking through the fury. "You picked the wrong night," she said, her voice quieter now, almost weary. "This was supposed to be about them, the kids I've helped, not about your grudge." The man stared at her, his defiance flickering, and the crowd watched, breathless, as the confrontation teetered on the edge of something bigger, something none of them had expected when the night began. The red carpet pulsed with a restless energy as Beyoncé's words lingered in the air, her gaze still fixed on the man whose bravado was crumbling under the weight of her quiet, piercing truth, his phone now a shaky extension of his faltering resolve. The crowd's noise swelled, arguments breaking out, voices overlapping in a jagged tangle of disbelief and support, and the young fan with the sign pushed harder against the ropes, her braids swinging as she shouted again, her voice cracking with urgency. "You're wrong about her. Sasha's my family. She'd tell you herself if she was here." The man whipped around, his face flushed and sweaty, and he snapped back. "Then where is she? Huh? Why is she not here defending her precious savior?" His sarcasm dripped heavy, but there was a tremor in it now, a crack in his armor that Beyoncé caught, her lips tightening as she watched him flounder. She took a slow breath, her hands unclenching slightly, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate, slicing through the chaos. "She's not here because she's working, because I made sure she had a stage to stand on. You'd know that if you cared about facts instead of headlines." The crowd murmured louder, some nodding, others frowning, their phones tilting as they recorded every word, every shift in the unfolding drama. The man's eyes darted to the fan, then back to Beyoncé, his grip on his phone tightening as he scrambled to regain control, his voice rising in a desperate pitch. "Working? Sure. Working for you, probably, while you take the credit. That's how it goes, right?" His accusation landed unevenly, and the crowd's reaction split. Some jeered at him, others muttered agreement, their uncertainty feeding the tension that coiled tighter with every passing second. Beyoncé's jaw clenched, her patience fraying, but before she could respond, an older woman in a sleek blazer, a reporter, her press badge glinting under the lights, stepped forward from the sidelines, her voice cutting and sharp and clear. "Actually, Sasha's on tour right now. I interviewed her last week. She wouldn't stop talking about how Beyoncé funded her first album." The revelation dropped like a stone into the chaos, and the crowd gasped, heads turning, whispers erupting as the man's face paled, his mouth opening soundlessly. Beyoncé's eyes flicked to the reporter, a flicker of gratitude passing through them, but she didn't soften. She turned back to the man, her voice low and firm. "You hear that? Or are you too busy yelling to listen?" He flinched, his shoulders hunching as the crowd's murmurs grew into a roar, their voices clashing, some chanting her name, others arguing over Sasha, the air thick with confusion and heat. The fan with the sign seized the moment, her voice trembling but fierce. "My cousin owes everything to her. You're just mad because you don't have a clue." The man spun toward her again, his frustration boiling over as he shouted, "Oh, you're related, so you're unbiased, huh? Real convenient." His sarcasm was losing its edge, though, and the crowd sensed it. Laughter rippled through some, while others hissed disapproval. their reaction splintering the scene further. Beyoncé stepped closer, her presence commanding despite the chaos, and she said, her tone icy and precise, "Convenience, you thinking you can ruin my night with a lie and walk away clean. You don't even know who you're fighting for." Her words hit him hard, and he staggered back a step, his phone dipping as his confidence unraveled, the crowd shifting mood pressing in on him from all sides. Then, unexpectedly, a new figure emerged from the throng, a teenage boy, no older than 16, his hoodie pulled low, his hands stuffed in his pockets as he slipped past security and darted toward Beyoncé, his voice breaking as he yelled, "She helped me too. I was nobody, and she gave me a shot." The crowd froze, stunned by the interruption, and security lunged forward, their hands grabbing at his arms. But Beyoncé waved them off, her eyes widening as she recognized him, Malik, one of the kids from her mentorship program. His demo tape still fresh in her memory. "Let him go," she said, her voice softening for the first time, and the guards backed off, their faces uncertain as the boy stood there, chest heaving, his gaze locked on her. "You don't know what she's done for us," he said, turning to the man, his words tumbling out fast and raw. "I was sleeping in my car, she got me a studio, a place to live. She's not what you think." The crowd erupted again, a wave of gasps and cheers crashing over them, and the man's face twisted, his defiance crumbling as he stared at the boy, then at Beyoncé, his narrative slipping through his fingers. The reporter nodded, scribbling furiously, and called out, "That checks out. Her program's funded dozens of kids like him." The man's head jerked toward her, his eyes wild now, and he shouted, "So what? Doesn't mean she didn't steal." But his voice was weaker, drowned out by the crowd's growing fervor, some yelling support for Beyoncé, others questioning him, their phones capturing the boy's trembling hands. The way Beyoncé's expression shifted from fury to something softer, more vulnerable. She looked at Malik, then at the fan, and finally back at the man, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "You want to talk about stealing? How about you stealing my piece tonight, my chance to celebrate them?" She gestured to the boy, to the fan, her hand shaking slightly, and the crowd quieted, hanging on her words as the air grew heavy with something unspoken, something real. The man's phone lowered further, his shoulders slumping, and for a moment, he looked small, lost in the chaos he'd ignited, while Beyoncé stood tall, her eyes glistening with a mix of pride and exhaustion, the weight of her humanity laid bare for all to see. The tension stretched taut, the crowd buzzing with anticipation as the confrontation teetered on a knife's edge, Malik's interruption, the reporter's confirmation, the fans' loyalty all colliding with the man's fading resolve. Beyoncé took a step back, her breath uneven, and she said, her voice quieter now, almost resigned, "I don't fight for myself, I fight for them. You wouldn't understand that." The man stared at her, his mouth working silently, and the crowd watched, their voices dropping to a low hum, sensing the shift, the way the night was bending towards something none of them had anticipated when the accusations first flew. The red carpet stood frozen in a breathless hush as Beyoncé's words sank into the crowd, her gaze steady on the man whose defiance had shrunk to a brittle shell. His phone dangling limply in his hand while Malik's raw confession and the fans' fierce loyalty hung heavy in the air. The teenage boy shifted nervously beside her, his hoodie slipping back to reveal wide, earnest eyes, and the reporter's pin scratched furiously, her blazer catching the light as she nodded to herself, muttering under her breath about deadlines and exclusives. The man's face twitched, his lips parting as if to argue, but before he could muster a sound, a sharp voice erupted from the crowd, a middle-aged woman in a sequin dress, her hair piled high, shoving her way to the front with a manicured hand clutched around a champagne flute. "You're a disgrace. She's a saint. You should be thanking her." The outburst jolted everyone, head snapping toward her, and the man wheeled around, his voice cracking as he shouted back, "Thanking her? For what? Taking what ain't hers?" His desperation was palpable now, a fraying thread stretched to its limit. But Beyoncé didn't flinch. She tilted her head, her expression hardening as she said, "You keep saying that, but you've got nothing to show for it. Where's your proof?" Her challenge landed like a quiet dare, and the crowd leaned in, their murmurs spiking as they waited for his response. He fumbled, his hands jerking up to swipe at his phone, his voice rising in a shaky rush. "It's out there, people know. Sasha's song, your song, same beat, same hook." But his words stumbled over each other, and the reporter cut in, her tone dry and cutting. "I've heard both tracks, different producers, different years. You're chasing ghosts." The crowd gasped, a ripple of surprise washing through them, and the man's face reddened, his eyes darting wildly as he snapped, "You're on her payroll, huh? All of you are." The accusation was frantic, unmoored, and the woman in the sequin dress laughed, a loud, scornful sound that made him flinch, before tossing back her drink and yelling, "Get a grip, buddy, she doesn't need to pay us to see you're full of it." The crowd erupted, some cheering her on, others shouting at the man, their voices clashing in a chaotic swell that threatened to swallow the night whole. Beyoncé watched it all, her chest rising and falling quickly, her hands trembling as she fought to keep her composure, the weight of their belief, and their doubt pressing down on her. Then, out of nowhere, a low rumble cut through the noise, a sleek black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb, its door flying open before the engine even settled, and a figure leapt out, breathless and wild-eyed, Sasha herself, her hair tangled from travel. Her jacket half-zipped as she shoved past security, her voice piercing the chaos. "Stop it. Stop this right now." The crowd froze, stunned into silence, and Beyoncé's head snapped toward her, her eyes widening as recognition hit, a flood of emotions, shock, relief, exhaustion flashing across her face. The man staggered back, his phone slipping from his grip to clatter on the carpet, and Sasha stormed forward, her hands balled into fists as she shouted at him, "You don't speak for me. You don't know a damn thing about what she's done." Her arrival flipped the scene upside down, the crowd reeling as they processed her presence, their phones swinging toward her, capturing every frantic gesture, every furious word. Beyoncé stepped toward her, her voice soft but firm. "Sasha, you didn't have to come. Why are you here?" Sasha spun to face her, her eyes glistening as she said, "Because I heard what he said. I couldn't let him do this to you." The man gaped, his bravado extinguished, and he stammered, You're defending her?" But Sasha cut him off, her voice shaking with anger. "After she what? Gave me a career? Paid my bills when I had nothing? You're out here screaming lies while I'm on tour because of her." The crowd exploded, cheers, gasps, a few stunned laughs, as the truth landed hard, undeniable now, and the man's shoulders slumped, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. Malik stepped closer, his voice quieter but steady. "She did the same for me, gave me a chance when nobody else would." The fan with the sign nodded furiously, tears streaking her face as she yelled, "See? That's who she is." The woman in the sequin dress raised her empty glass, her voice slurring slightly as she called out, "Told you, Saint." The reporter scribbled faster, muttering, "This is gold," and the air buzzed with a new energy, the tide turning fully against the man as the crowd's faith in Beyoncé solidified, their voices rising in a messy, triumphant roar. Beyoncé looked at Sasha, then at Malik, her breath catching as she took in their faces the kids she'd fought for, standing there defending her, and something shifted in her, a crack in the armor she'd worn all night. She turned to the man, her voice low, almost gentle. "You wanted to break me down, but you brought them here instead. That's what I'm about, not your lies." He stared at her, mute and hollow, his plan in ashes, and Sasha grabbed her arm, her grip tight as she said, "Let's go inside, this isn't worth your time." But Beyoncé shook her head, her eyes glistening now, and she faced the crowd, her voice rising above the noise. "No, they need to hear this. I don't run from the truth, and I don't run from them." The crowd hushed, hanging on her every word, and she continued, her tone raw and unfiltered. "I've made mistakes, I've stumbled, but I've never taken what wasn't mine. I've given more than you'll ever know." Her admission, honest, unguarded, stunned them, and the man sank back, defeated, as Sasha squeezed her arm tighter, whispering, "You don't have to prove anything." But Beyoncé smiled faintly, her voice steadying. "Maybe not, but I will anyway." The scene teetered on the edge of chaos and clarity, the crowd buzzing with awe as Sasha's arrival, Malik's courage, and Beyoncé's vulnerability collided in a moment no one had seen coming. The man stood there, a shadow of his former self, while the woman in the sequin dress swayed, muttering, "That's how you shut it down," and the reporter grinned, already framing her headline. Beyoncé's eyes swept over them all, her accuser, her defenders, the onlookers, and she stood taller, the fire in her reignited, ready to turn the night back to what it was meant to be. The red carpet trembled with a raw, electric stillness as Beyoncé's words settled over the crowd, her voice lingering in the air like a promise she'd carved out of the chaos, her eyes shimmering with a quiet strength that held everyone captive, Sasha at her side. Malik close behind, the man who'd started it all now reduced to a silent, slouched figure clutching his fallen phone. The woman in the sequin dress swayed slightly, her empty glass dangling from her fingers as she muttered to no one in particular, "That's how you finish a fight," her voice slurring into the murmurs that rippled through the onlookers, their phones still raised. Though some had lowered them now, their faces soft with something like reverence. Sasha's grip on Beyoncé's arm tightened, her breath uneven as she whispered, "Come on, let's go, they've seen enough." But Beyoncé shook her head gently, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, the reporters, the fan with the sign who was wiping her eyes with her sleeve. And she said, her tone firm yet weary, "No, they need to understand, this isn't just about me anymore." The crowd hushed again, their arguments fading into a tense, expectant quiet, and even the man looked up, his expression unreadable, caught between shame and defiance as her presence pulled them all back into her orbit. Before anyone could respond, a new voice broke through, a deep, gravelly shout from the back of the throng. "She's right. I owe her too." Heads turned, and the crowd parted unevenly as a burly man in a faded leather jacket pushed forward, his beard streaked with gray, his hands rough and calloused as he waved off security with a glare. Beyoncé's brow furrowed, recognition flickering in her eyes, and she murmured, "Darius." The man nodded, his voice booming as he said, "Yeah, it's me 10 years ago. You paid for my daughter's surgery when I couldn't. Didn't even know me, just saw me begging outside a show." The crowd gasped, a fresh wave of surprise rolling through them, and the reporter's pen froze mid-scratch, her head snapping up as she muttered, "Wait, what?" Sasha's jaw dropped, her hand falling from Beyoncé's arm, and Malik shifted closer, his voice quiet but awed. "You never told us that." Beyoncé's lips parted, her breath catching as she looked at Darius, then back at the crowd, and she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't talk about it because it's not for praise, it's just what you do." The man in the denim jacket flinched, his hands shoving into his pockets as Darius stepped closer, his eyes locked on him as he growled, "You're out here accusing her when she's saved people you'll never meet. My kid's alive because of her." The crowd erupted. Cheers, shouts, a few stunned sobs, and the fan with the sign threw her arms up, yelling, "That's what I've been saying." The woman in the sequined dress stumbled forward, nearly spilling into a guard as she slurred, "See? Saint, I told you." The man shrank further, his shoulders hunching as the weight of Darius's words, Sasha's fury, and Malik's truth pressed down on him, his earlier fire snuffed out by the stories piling up around him. Beyoncé raised a hand, her voice cutting through the noise, "Enough, stop it, all of you. This isn't a contest." The crowd quieted, startled by her shift, and she turned to the man, her eyes steady but softer now as she said, "You wanted to hurt me, and I get it. Things aren't fair out there. But this." She gestured to Sasha, Malik, Darius. "This is what I fight for, not against you." He stared at her, his mouth working silently, and then, unexpectedly, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I didn't know. I just thought you were like the rest." The admission hung there, fragile and unguarded, and the crowd murmured, some nodding, others frowning, their reactions a jumbled mix of pity and surprise. Beyoncé's expression softened further, her shoulders relaxing as she said, "I'm not, and I don't need you to believe me. Just stop tearing down what you don't understand." Sasha stepped forward, her voice sharp but steady. "She's given us everything, maybe start asking why you're so mad instead of who." The man blinked, his hands falling limp at his sides, and for the first time, he looked away, his gaze dropping to the carpet as the crowd watched, their phones dipping slightly, the frenzy giving way to a strange, reflective calm. Darius clapped a hand on Malik's shoulder, his voice gruff but warm. "She's the real deal, kid, don't ever forget that." Malik nodded, his eyes shining as he said, "I won't." "She changed my life." The fan with the sign pushed closer, her voice breaking as she called out, "Mine too, just watching her made me believe I could do something." The reporter scribbled again, muttering, "This is bigger than I thought." And the woman in the sequined dress hiccuped, raising her glass in a shaky toast, to Beyoncé, Queen of Queens. The crowd laughed, some cheering, and Beyoncé smiled, a small, tired curve of her lips, as she looked at them all, her voice quiet but clear, "I'm no queen. I'm just someone who keeps going. That's all." The simplicity of it landed hard, and the man in the denim jacket shifted, his head bowing slightly as he muttered, "I'm sorry, I didn't. I'm sorry." The words were barely audible, but they hit the air like a release, and Beyoncé nodded, her eyes glistening as she said, "I hear you." The night shifted, the tension unraveling into something softer, more human, as the crowd began to talk among themselves, some hugging, others debating, their voices a low hum of wonder and reassessment. Sasha linked her arm through Beyoncé's, whispering, "You didn't have to do that, he didn't deserve it." But Beyoncé shook her head, her voice firm, "It's not about deserving, it's about showing them who we are." Malik grinned, Darius chuckled, and the fan with the sign clutched it tighter, her face glowing with pride. The reporter called out, "This is going on the front page," and the woman in the sequin dress stumbled away, muttering, "Best night ever." Beyoncé took a deep breath, her gaze lingering on the man as he slipped back into the crowd, unnoticed now, and she turned toward the venue, her step steady as she said, "Let's go celebrate what matters." The crowd parted for her, their cheers rising again, but it was their quiet respect, the way they looked at her, at Sasha, at Malik, at Darius, that echoed loudest, a lesson carved into the night they'd never forget.